Well, welcome everyone. It's 10:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. I think we had 39 people registered. I see 22 in the meeting, so a few more may pop in, but we'll get going. So welcome to today's presentation on the Oregon Realtors Forum 1.9 Invitation to Escalate. So this is the Oregon Realtors sort of riff off of a traditional escalation clause or escalation clause addendum, and we're going to talk today about escalation clauses generally, about the Oregon Realtors escalation invitation to escalate form and what's different about it than a typical escalation clause, and show you how to use that form. So the first thing I want to do, though, is just talk a little bit more about the training resources that we have available to you at Oregon Realtors. In addition to today's training, we've got a lot out there for you and want to make sure that you're aware of that and know where to find it. We're going to talk a little bit about what is a typical escalation clause. We're going to talk about the risks of typical escalation clauses, both for buyers and their brokers and also for sellers and their brokers. Talk about how sellers can respond to typical escalation clauses. Talk about some legal and ethical considerations around the escalation clause. Then we'll begin talking about our form, the invitation to escalate form 1.9, how it's different. We'll go section by section to review that form and teach you how to use it. Then we'll talk about some forthcoming changes to that form that will be coming at the next round of our forms updates. And then we'll do question and answer. So hopefully that sounds like a good agenda for everyone. Plan on getting you out of here before 11. At 11 o'clock, we do have our forms info session / open house that occurs every Friday at 11. So feel free to pop over to that meeting as well. Nicholas Peasley, our staff attorney, will be running that meeting, and you can ask additional questions about any form that you have questions about. So first, let's just talk a little bit about some of the training resources that we have available to you related to the Oregon Realtors forms. So hopefully you all have bookmarked our forums website, which is orforms.org. That is your hub for all things Oregon Realtors forms. And on that website, you will see a tab at the top that is called training. And if you click on that training tab, it will take you to our training page. And that page will show you what options you have for training. We have training in a variety of formats. We have self-paced trainings, live trainings. We have our weekly open house that I mentioned, and then we have some additional recorded tutorials. So let's talk just a minute about what each of those are. Live trainings are what you're taking part in today. We do them every Friday at 10 a.m. We choose a different forum to focus on for that training. We've already done well over a dozen of these. And we have them scheduled out for the next couple of months. And then once we, in probably another few weeks here, we'll start scheduling additional live trainings on the calendar. So you'll see additional options available. But if you go to that live training button on the website right now, you can see all the ones that are currently scheduled. We intend to keep doing these weekly live trainings for as long as we have members who need to learn about our forms. And we expect that means we'll just keep continuing to do it. We may start recycling some of the topics once we've gotten through all the forms. The next thing we have are the self-paced trainings. So anytime we do a live training like today, we will record that training. And then after we get it processed and ready for CE credit to watch as a video, we will put it in the self-paced training library. And that we do that in partnership with Online Ed for the CE credit. If you go to the self-paced training button and click on that, you'll be able to watch all of the previous live trainings that we did and receive CE credit for them if you access them through that self-paced training button. The next thing is the open house. I mentioned that happens at 11 right after this. We always have an attorney available at 11 o'clock on Fridays who helped in drafting the forms, available to you so that you can ask questions or bring up issues related to the forms or your use of the forms. So you can drop into that anytime. You can stay for the whole time. You can drop in and just ask a question and pop out. Whatever it is that you need to do, you are able to do that. Typically those have been lasting about a half an hour based on the number of people that are showing up. But if more people start showing up, we'll stick around for up to an hour to answer whatever questions come up. Finally, we have recorded tutorials. These are shorter form videos, not full-length CE credit level videos, but additional recorded videos that are on topics related to forms that you might find helpful. So check that out as well. We also have what we call our guided forms library. The guided forms library is a video annotated version of each of our forms. So if you scroll down that training page, you'll see the guided forms library section of the page. You'll see on the left-hand column the list of our forms. On the right side, you will see green bars with that say guided forms with videos. If you click on that green bar that says guided form with video, it will pull up a guided version of the form. So for example, here is the form we're talking about today, invitation to Escalate offer. We have a guided video version of that. So if you click on that, you'll come up and you'll see these little blue play icons on the left-hand column. If you click those icons, a video will pop out explaining that section of the document. We have videos for every section of every document that we have in our forms library. So most of those are now up on the website. We still have a handful that we're getting up on the site, but all of the sale agreements and most of the key addendum are up and available for your use. All right, so let me just see if there's anything in the chat, and then we will start talking about what's the site again, please. The site is orforms.org. Let me drop that into the chat. orforms.org is our forms website. Everything you need to know about the Oregon Realtors forms is there. And by the way, I think I may have failed to introduce myself. I am Jeremy Rogers, the Director of Legal Affairs here at Oregon Realtors, and one of the attorneys that helped in drafting these forms. So let's talk about escalation clauses generally. What are they? This comes from Freddie Mac. I thought they did a good job explaining what an escalation clause is. An escalation clause is language written into a purchase offer that automatically increases the purchase price by a certain amount above competing offers until the offer reaches the maximum price that the buyer is willing to pay for the home. Okay, so that is a good summary of what a typical escalation clause is. Elements of that include there's going to be a base offer price. Okay, you're offering a certain amount, but you're then offering to beat a competing offer by up to X amount. Okay, oftentimes people write in $1,000, for example. There will be a maximum escalation price, which we call a cap. Okay, so you might say that you will beat competing offers by $1,000 up to $650,000, whatever the number might be. And then requirement of proof of the bona fide competing offer, okay? So that the seller is going to be required to demonstrate to the buyer who included the escalation clause that there was in fact that competing offer and the terms of that offer that triggered the escalation. So let's take a look at an example of for an escalation clause. Listing price might be $590,000. Buyer's base offer price maybe $600,000. They include an escalation clause that says something to the effect of, buyer will pay $1,000 more than the highest competing offer up to a maximum of $630,000 with evidence of bona fide competing offer. Okay, so that is kind of a typical way you see this happening. When are these used? Oftentimes they're used in highly competitive markets. Okay, and if it's not a highly competitive market, most of the time buyer is not going to want to put themselves at risk of having to pay more than their base offer price for the home. So it is used as a strategy to help a buyer compete when there might be bidding wars for the home. We were seeing a lot of escalation clauses, a few years ago, but over time, over the last year or so, that's really cooled off. Here's a headline from NAR saying that escalation clauses really losing their appeal as the bidding wars cool off. That was at the end of 2021. So you're probably seeing a lot less of these now than you were, say, 2 years ago. What are some risks associated with escalation clauses? Now, obviously, there are advantages. I mean, a buyer would use an escalation clause because they want to have a competitive offer and they want to get the home. And by communicating to the seller that, hey, I'm willing to beat competing offers and even give you a little bit of margin over that, the buyer is positioning themselves to be more likely to win that bid. But we are the legal risk management department here at the Oregon Realtors. So, we like to talk about what are the risks of these things and help you prepare for those risks. So let's talk about what the risks of a typical escalation clause are for a buyer and the buyer's broker. So first off, the buyer is compromising their negotiating position, okay? One way to think about it is maybe their maximum is now becoming the minimum because they have communicated to the seller how much they're willing to pay for the house if they include that maximum. Typically, the seller does not know how high a buyer is willing to go. And that means that there's risk on the seller in the seller's strategy in terms of how they negotiate or counteroffer with the buyer. Here, the buyer is sort of showing their cards. They are telling the seller in advance how high they're willing to go, so that in one respect, that might be okay for the buyer because they want to get that house at all costs, as long as it does not go above their maximum. On the other hand, there's situations where a buyer could end up paying more for the house than they otherwise would have had they not indicated how high they were willing to go. Another big risk, and this is really why one of the main reasons why we drafted our escalation addendum the way that we did, is that there can be ambiguity in the final purchase price. And that means that there would be an unenforceable contract, because a contract needs to have a definitive price term. It's perhaps the most material term of the contract. And if the parties can both reasonably come to different conclusions about what that price term is, then there is no contract, because there was never a meeting of the minds about the price, which is required for contract formation. And so the way that could play out is that if an escalation clause was included, but it wasn't specific enough, then the parties could have a different interpretation about what the price is. So, for example, if I put in an escalation clause saying that I am willing to pay $1,000 more than the highest offer, but the highest offer, it has a price, okay, it has an offer price, say $600,000, but it also includes seller concessions to buyer, that seller is going to pay $1,000 or $2,000 of buyer's closing costs. Okay, how does that factor in? Is that counted or is that not counted? And reasonable minds could come to a different conclusion on that if it's not written specifically into the contract, which means that you could end up, seller could end up accepting an offer with an escalation clause, believing the purchase price to be one thing and the buyer believing it to be another. So we tried to avoid that with the way we've drafted our escalation addendum. The other thing that can happen is a confusing bidding war. Sometimes multiple buyers will use escalation clause, and then you have one offer escalating another. That can get very, very confusing. We've also tried to draft around that problem with our escalation addendum. And another issue that can happen is that it could push the price higher than the appraised value. Now, if a buyer maintains their appraisal contingency and their financing contingency, then that may ultimately not, that ultimately might be a risk buyer is willing to take, because they will get their earnest money back. But it still, in that case, could end in a lot of delay and perhaps costs that the buyer has put in to investigate the property that end up being lost. Or if the buyer is very desperate for the home and they waive their appraisal contingency, then the buyer could be in a very bad spot if the home does not appraise at the high value that was created by that escalation clause, because they're going to be contractually obligated to still purchase the home if they had waived their appraisal contingency. So they're going to have to come up with the cash, make up the difference, or they're going to lose their earnest money because they're not able to follow through with the deal. And of course, if a buyer ends up paying quote unquote too much for the house, okay, and that's kind of subjective. Too much could mean they, at the end of the deal, just have a bad feeling that they could have got it for less if they didn't include the escalation clause. Or it could be that it actually does get pushed up above the appraised value, or for whatever that means to buyer, too much, they're going to be upset about that, right? Or if the deal fails because the clause was not written properly and it was ambiguous and the parties didn't actually agree on the ultimate price, or if the buyer loses their earnest money for any reason, like the appraised value is not high enough and they waived their appraisal contingency, then they're going to likely blame their broker for letting them do that. Okay, so that's why we're here today, to talk about risks and to show you our document, which we hope tries to mitigate some of these risks for you. If I see a question in the Q&A, let me pull that up. Would love to discuss multiple escalation clauses. Where does it stop? Yeah, I think that there isn't a good answer to that question. And that's why we have dealt with that in our addendum. So when we get to our addendum, we can sort of talk about how we worked through that issue in addressing the multiple escalation clause issue. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to end with whoever has the highest maximum purchase price, because each of those escalations is going to drive it up to that final maximum price. But that's pretty messy to do that when you're, going back and forth. Whereas in our addendum, we just address that issue directly. All right, so what about the seller side? What are some of the risks on the seller side? Well, that ambiguity issue is still a major problem for the seller as well as the buyer, okay? We've already talked about that. There could be a difference in interpretation of the ultimate price term if the escalation clause was not written particularly enough to deal with things like seller concessions or other terms that may differ between the offer that escalated and the ultimate offer that was accepted. If that escalation does push the price higher than appraised value, then that means that the seller also could be wasting a lot of time by going forward with this. And so there is a cost to the seller on that as well. And then there could be an issue where a listing firm also represents one of the buyers whose offer would be used to trigger the escalation. And that's pretty much an untenable situation. That firm really cannot be loyal to both the seller and to that buyer. I mean, their goal with the buyer they represent would be to get the buyer of the house. But here, the buyer's offer would be used to actually trigger an escalation clause so that some other buyer could get the house. So I don't know how often this comes up, but it's something that you should think about and make sure you protect against. You would never want to be in a situation where you had your firm had a listing, but also was representing a buyer trying to get that house, and that other buyer was essentially going to be used as a pawn to trigger the escalation for the ultimate buyer who actually wins the bidding war. So let us talk about ambiguity a little bit more. We talked about this. Purchase price ambiguity could be because like seller concessions, and that's not specified as to whether it's net of seller concessions when we're calculating the price, the offer price. We talked about the multiple competing escalation clause issue, super messy. I mean, at the end of the day, that's likely to be resolved by the person with the highest maximum offer price in their escalation clause, their cap being the one that wins, but it's a messy way to get there. And then what about when the terms are different? What if one offer is a seller carried financing offer and another is loan financing? Well, that's really materially different, and if the parties didn't specify in the escalation clause, hey, we're only talking about other offers that are similar types of offers, that it's going to be a bank loan, not a seller carried transaction, then you could end up having a seller trying to trigger an offer, your escalation clause offer, even though the other one was a seller carried offer. Or maybe there is contingency waivers in one offer and not in the other. How does that play into the trigger of the escalation? How similar do the terms of these offers need to be to trigger these escalations? So that's where all, areas where ambiguity can arise and lead to conflict, which either can create a problem for contract formation if the parties do end up going forward, but it's unclear what the contract means, or it could just create conflict and blow up the deal from the beginning. Now, sometimes we get asked the question, is it lawful to share the terms of a buyer's offer with another buyer? Because part of these escalation clauses is that you are going to have to prove the bona fide offer that triggered the escalation clause. Oregon has no prohibition on sharing one buyer's offer with another buyer. Some states do have that prohibition, okay? So if you're practicing in states other than Oregon, you need to make sure you're checking the laws of your state, because several states do prohibit you sharing one buyer's offer with another buyer unless the buyer whose offer you're sharing has given permission to do so. Code of Ethics talks about something here too. It says that when you're entering a buyer agreement, okay, so if you're entering a representation agreement to represent a buyer, you need to inform them of the possibility. I am actually going to just close the door here real quick, folks. I have 2 kids that are being watched at my house right now, and I need to, they're loud in the background. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. All right. So the Code of Ethics says that if you're entering a buyer representation agreement with your buyer, you need to inform them about the possibility that the terms and conditions of and existence of their offer may be shared. Okay, they are not confidential once you've given them to the seller. The seller may share them. Okay, and in Oregon, as I mentioned, there is no law about that. Okay, so unless there's some other confidentiality agreement, the seller is going to be free to share the terms of the buyer's offer. Let me see what the Q question is here. Assuming a seller agrees to the sharing. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're representing your seller, obviously your seller has to, they're the boss. They're directing you. And so if your seller wants to play the escalation clause game and give you permission to share the terms of other buyers' offers, then they can do that. But you're not going to take action without your seller's permission because you're representing your seller. One of the ways we encourage folks to deal with that is at the time that you enter the listing agreement, have the conversation with the seller and even put into writing sort of how you're going to deal with certain situations like escalation clauses. Okay, so is your seller willing to entertain escalation clauses? Are they interested in sharing the terms of one buyer's offer with another buyer as part of the escalation process? You can have that discussion up front, get it all in writing. And that way, if you do come into a situation where you're getting multiple offers and some contain escalation clauses, you don't have to sort of pause and figure that out at the time with your seller. You've already got it built in to the terms of your listing agreements you established up front with your seller. So how can sellers respond to a typical escalation clause? Okay, so we're not talking about the Oregon Realtors Forum yet. We're talking about a typical escalation clause. Well, what we generally counsel sellers to do if they do receive a typical escalation clause is counter the escalation clause offer at a specific price term. And oftentimes what you'll see happen here is a counter at the maximum price term. Okay, if a buyer sends you an offer saying, hey, I'm offering 600,000, but I'm willing to escalate $1,000 above the highest offer up to 630,000. Buyers now communicated they're willing to pay up to $630,000 for the house. One option you have as a seller would be to counter the buyer at $630,000. Okay. Now, is there some risk there? May you piss off the buyer? Perhaps. But you can avoid the ambiguity of accepting the escalation clause offer, okay, and just counter with a specific price term. So you and the buyer are very clear on what price you're agreeing to once you agree to the deal. And the buyer's already put a marker out there about how high they're willing to go. So it does give the seller some advantage in the negotiation. Another option, you could reject all offers and ask for new offers from all the buyers at the highest and best price and terms. Okay. So you might say, you know what? I don't really want to play. I appreciate there's an escalation clause. It's communicated to me that the buyers are willing to go higher. Okay. And I want to get a higher price, but I don't want to accept this escalation clause offer because it's ambiguous. I don't want to play that game. I'm going to ask all buyers, hey, there was competing offers on this price. Give me your one best shot at how much you're willing to pay for this house. And then every buyer is going to put their best foot forward and the seller can accept a single offer that does not contain the ambiguity problems of the escalation clause. I see some questions. Let's see. Pros and cons of sharing. So let me get back to that here in a second, the pros and cons of sharing. So that's how we typically would advise someone to deal with an escalation clause. You don't have to do that. A seller can, of course, just accept the offer with the escalation clause. I mean, typically when a buyer includes an escalation clause, their intent is to get the seller to accept that offer and then come back and show them the competing offer. And then the buyer, in theory, would be locked in to paying the $1,000 more than the competing offer up to the cap. But as we mentioned, the problem that happens with that oftentimes is these clauses aren't written well enough to really make perfectly clear what the price is. So can you do it? Can you accept the escalation clause offer as is? Absolutely. But our recommendation is to take one of these two strategies laid out here to get around the ambiguity problem and make sure that you have certainty in your price. So someone had just asked about pros and cons of sharing. You know, I don't know if that's really necessarily like a legal risk management question, more of a strategy question. So I would say talk to your principal broker about that and other brokers. I don't see a ton of downsides to sharing. I mean, if you receive an escalation clause and you want to entertain negotiations with the buyer who is willing to pay more, I don't see a lot of downsides in sharing the terms of the other buyer's offer. But again, I think that's less of a risk management question, more of a strategy question. So definitely encourage you to talk to your principal broker and others in the field from the business side of it. But I don't see a lot of cons to doing that. In Oregon, obviously in other states where it's prohibited by law, you have other things to worry about. So our invitation to escalate is basically taking this counteroffer model, but making it kind of even better and clearer, and increasing the likelihood of success for both parties. So the Oregon Realtors Form 1.9 is basically a seller counteroffer that's made on the terms of the buyer's escalation clause. Okay, so we're going to talk about what we mean by that here now as we look at the invitation to escalate. So Form 1.9, we actually call it the invitation to escalate offer. Here's what it looks like in your forms library. And we'll go through section by section here in a minute, but first, let's just talk about what's different. So it's an invitation for the seller to come back to the buyer, okay? So it is not an offer that the seller accepts immediately. With a traditional escalation clause, we mentioned on the last slide, we gave you some strategies like countering, but in theory, on a traditional escalation clause, seller could just accept that offer and including the escalation clause, and then the price would be automatically increased based upon the competing offer. But here we say, seller, do not accept this invitation, do not accept the offer yet. This is an invitation to come back to the buyer with the competing offer to demonstrate to the buyer what the competing offer is. And at that time, the buyer and seller will now enter into the agreement, because at that time, they will now both be on the same page about what the ultimate price is. Okay, so the buyer gets to sort of sign off on the escalated deal before it's finalized. So that's really kind of one of the key distinctions between our approach and a traditional escalation clause. We do this to remove the ambiguity. We specify in the document how the price will be calculated. We address the multiple escalation clause scenario. We address how to deal with offers with different terms, okay? We also specify which offers cannot trigger an escalation clause. And by the buyer getting that opportunity to sign off, we've addressed the problem of the parties agreeing to a contract without having a meeting of the minds about the price. So let's look at each section. We start this thing like we do all of our addenda, okay? We have a sale agreement number in the top left, property address or description, parties to the agreement, okay? Nothing to talk about here, but it's this is our format for all of our documents. The first substantive section here, we describe the use of the addendum. So here's where we explain how this is supposed to work. And the buyer is going to submit this invitation to escalate. At the same time, they submit buyer's offer or counteroffer. So if buyer's submitting an offer, that offer is going to be filled out as it normally would. Okay, it's going to have a price in it. You're not going to worry about the writing in an escalation clause to the offer. Instead, you're going to take this Form 1.9 invitation to escalate and also fill it out and attach it with the offer, providing both to the seller. Now, from the seller's perspective, their instructions are to, they need to, before the expiration of the offer deadline and the underlying offer, okay, they can sign this escalation addendum and provide buyer a copy of it and the proof of the other offer that is triggering the escalation. Then buyer's going to have the chance in section 13 to sign the agreement to escalate, okay, and deliver back to the seller. And at that time, then they'll be deemed to both have approved of the escalated terms after having both been able to review what those terms are. Okay. Now, we do allow buyer to, in this addendum, to include in their escalation offer to match waivers of terms and contingencies that are in the competing offer. We'll go through that section in more depth, but we do include a sentence here at the end that buyer should consult with an attorney before doing that. Okay, because obviously that would put buyer at risk to waive protections for buyer. And so we want to make sure that buyer is aware of the risk and that they should seek appropriate advice before doing that. We also warn buyer that they should not put as a maximum price more than they're willing to pay, okay, because it may end up being that the price does get escalated to that high of a level. Now, of course, buyer is going to get a second bite at the apple here to ultimately approve. So buyer could end up backing out of this deal. But in any event, buyer should only put forward numbers that they're truly willing to pay. So the next section in 4, this is where we actually describe the terms of the escalation. So we use the term net purchase price, okay? And we say that the net purchase price, we have a field for that to be entered. And we say that the buyer's offer, okay, which is in the underlying sale agreement, will increase to a net purchase price that is blank amount greater than the net purchase price in the competing offer. And I mentioned oftentimes people use $1,000 or so, but that's up to you and your client to decide. If the seller delivers a copy of the competing offer before the buyer's offer deadline, that's key. It has to be before the buyer's offer deadline in the underlying sale agreement, and buyer signs section 13 of this document. Those are both required to make this effective. We now describe what we mean by net purchase price. This is where our first step in getting rid of some of that ambiguity. We say that it is the stated purchase price adjusted down for any monetary credits to buyer, for example, closing costs, or up for any monetary credits to seller. Okay, now there typically isn't monetary credits to seller, but we wanted to cover our bases here. We also say that if the competing offer contains an escalation clause, that the net purchase price of the competing offer will be the maximum purchase price of that offer, adjusted for monetary credits to buyer or monetary credits to seller. Okay, so for example, if the offer is $400,000, but $2,000 of closing costs to be paid by seller, okay, that adjustment is going to be made. Okay, I can't remember. I'm blanking on the number I just said, but so if the offer was 400,000 and there was $2,000 in seller credit to buyer, then it would be $398,000 would be the net purchase price. Okay, so we're agreeing to a net here, incorporating those credits. Now let's talk about this last piece about the competing escalation clause. So I mentioned before, if you did have competing escalation clauses, what you probably would, in a typical escalation clause scenario, you'd have a really messy process. But at the end of the day, where it would likely land if you were able to guide the process would be that whoever has the highest maximum is going to be the one that ends up winning. So here we just cut to the chase. If there's competing escalations, the maximum, the cap in the competing escalation is going to be the price that's used to determine the net price. Okay, so we don't want there to be a whole bunch of back and forth. We don't want there to be multiple evidences of multiple offers and having to figure that all out. In this situation, seller would take the offer with the competing offer with the highest cap, and they would say, this is the offer that's going to trigger the escalation. This is the offer I'm going to provide evidence of, and that cap price is going to be the price that is used for determining the escalated price. Okay, let me see if there's any questions in the Q&A. Oh, okay. All right, any questions about price determination? All right, so let's take a look at the next section, section 5. This is where the buyer is going to indicate their max purchase price, okay? So that's the cap that this buyer who is completing the Form 1.9 invitation to escalate, the highest price they are willing to go. Section 6, this is where we deal with the issue of the competing offer having different and more favorable terms, okay? Because as you all know, it's not just about price, it's about price and terms. So we wanted to give this buyer who's inviting the seller to come back to them with a competing offer the opportunity to communicate to the seller if they would be willing to match certain waivers that are included in the competing offer. Okay. So here, the buyer by checkbox can indicate if they were willing to waive these various rights that are included in the underlying sale agreement, including the right to terminate based on the buyer's due diligence, okay, the right to perform informational inspections, the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, the title contingency, the lead hazard inspections, and the property disclosure statement, okay? And because even though that's required under Oregon law, buyers can waive the residential seller property disclosure statement. And we have an ag land, vacant land disclosure statement as part of our ag land, vacant land transactions. Buyer can waive those as well. Now, the way we set up this waiver, we do not want to make this easy for folks because waiving contingencies that favor buyer is very risky to buyer and it's very risky to agents because if it doesn't work out for the buyer, and they wish that they had kept that contingency, they're going to blame their agent, okay? So we have a form that is for waiving contingencies. It's the form that would be used if you were not even dealing with this escalation clause and you were just dealing with an offer and your buyer wanted to waive certain contingencies in the sale agreement, you would have to use our form 2.14 to do the waiver. We don't build the waiver into our base sale agreement because we want to make sure the buyer has read that 2.14 and understands the serious consequences to the buyer of waiving. And that 2.14 also explains in detail that the agent is not advising the buyer to waive, and that the buyer is holding the agent harmless from that waiver because it was a voluntary decision by buyer after being warned about the consequences. So I'll show you what that form looks like here in a minute, but buyer is actually going to have to sign here in section 6 and attest that they have in fact reviewed that form 2.14 waiver document before they agree to check any of these boxes so that you have evidence that they have been sufficiently warned of the consequences. Okay. I'll get to that question here in a minute. This is what that 2.14 modification or waivers of contingencies addendum looks like. You will see that section 3 up front, that big disclaimer. Okay, that's just the beginning. This form goes on and on to warn the buyer. In many ways, we tell the buyer what the purpose of the contingency is and how it benefits them for each of the contingencies in the sale agreement. We explain to the buyer what the consequences of waiving that particular contingency are, and then the buyer has that opportunity to waive. If your buyer is going to do this invitation to escalate and they're considering doing this matching of waiver provisions, just make sure that they really take the time to understand what that means and what they could be giving up. Let me take a look at the chat. That does not include the estate commission. About different fee splits. Yeah, so the calculation of the net here is not going to have anything to do with the real estate commissions. We're just talking about the purchase price and then any closing costs that like seller would be paying on behalf of buyer, that amount. Okay, but we're not going to be factoring in we're not going to be factoring in other commission issues or fee splits, only if it's a concession that the seller is making as part of an offer saying, yes, I'm willing to pay X amount of your closing costs. All right, so the next section we deal with multiple offers. So we say that seller may present evidence of only a single competing offer with valid competing offer waivers if there are multiple competing offers on the property. We do not want a scenario where the seller is coming back to the buyer and saying, hey, well, here's one offer that it could trigger your escalation that has a price of $450,000, but does not include waiver of inspections. Here's one at $459,000 that does include waiver of inspections. Let's which one do you want to escalate on? We don't want to get messy with this. So we say you really in particular, if it's going to include these waiver issues, you have to pick one competing offer that's going to be used to trigger that escalation clause, so that we do not have to deal with that confusion. That's going to just create confusion, conflict, and likely lead to a bad result if the seller's trying to come back with multiple offers with varying terms to try to get the buyer to kind of mix and match and agree to the best of both. Okay. We don't want the seller being able to say, well, hey, I want you to match the price on this one, but the waivers on this one, for example. All right, so question was, how can a potential buyer ensure that their escalation clause is competitive and will be effective in multiple offer situations? Well, I think that if a buyer wants to do an escalation clause and take the risk that they are, going to have to pay more than their baseline offer price, the maximum price they're willing to pay, whatever they put into that maximum amount, is at the end of the day sort of likely to be probably the biggest factor that would determine if they're ultimately going to be successful. Okay, because now the seller knows how high they're willing to go. And if there's competing escalations, that one with the maximum is going to be the one, the highest cap or the highest maximum is going to be the one that sort of wins out. So again, if that's what your buyer wants, then that would be probably, a strategy to do it, make that cap high enough. But that means your buyer's going to end up paying a lot more for the house too. So, this is all a trade-off. So the next section we talk about here are, we say seller's discretion. We want to make it clear, because buyers don't always understand this, that the seller's not required to accept buyer's offer. But some buyer might say, hey, I included an escalation in my offer and nobody else did, so my offer is the best. That means it has to be accepted by the seller. That's not true. Okay, the seller can accept a different offer if they want. Maybe the seller just doesn't want to engage in this whole escalation business. The seller is not required to accept buyer's offer just because it is included in an escalation and because buyer believes it was the best offer. Okay, so that means they don't have to accept the highest net purchase price. They don't have to accept the one with the most waivers. Seller's going to have the decision as long as they're making that decision lawfully. They're not violating fair housing laws, for example. That they can make that decision based on the criteria that are most important to them. Okay, so buyer needs to know that this isn't a guaranteed winner just because they're escalating. All right, so the next section is where the buyer, this is the first place, other than the waiver provision, okay, where buyer would be signing kind of as an interim step and saying, all right, here's my invitation to escalate. Okay, this deal's not done yet. You haven't came back to me. We haven't finally signed off on it, but I'm signing off on my invitation to you to come back to me with the competing offer, and I'm interested in escalating under the terms that I included earlier here in this escalation. Okay, so this is where the buyer is going to sign off and then deliver over to the seller. And then it's going to become some steps that the seller is going to take. I see there's a question in the chat. Let's see what that is. Oh, okay. All right. So now we start giving some instructions to the seller about their steps once they've received this thing. So this now is where we're describing the competing offer. Okay, evidence of that competing offer and what are some limitations on the terms of that competing offer if it's going to be used to trigger the escalation. So again, it's got to happen. This all has to happen before the buyer's original offer deadline. Okay, as soon as that buyer's original offer deadline expires, it's expired. Okay, so of course the parties can, extend that, but we're trying to get this done before the buyer's offer has expired, because that buyer might just move on somewhere else after that expiration. So prior to accepting the buyer's offer, counteroffer seller may present the competing offers to the buyer in this escalation. And that presentment of the competing offer essentially is acting as a counteroffer to the buyer, saying, hey, buyer, I'm counter offering you to agree now to the terms of this deal based upon your escalation statement, how high you're, if you're $1,000 more than the best competing offer and the terms of that competing offer, which I'm now providing to you. I'm essentially counter offering you to agree to like actually enter the deal with me under those new terms that we now are aware of because we have this competing offer that I'm showing you. So they should redact or remove all personally identifying information from that offer. Obviously, the material terms need to be there, but we don't need to be sharing the names of all the people making these offers. Okay. There's nothing in Oregon law that requires that, but we're just trying to create a little bit of extra privacy. So they send that along with copies of any addenda that are relevant to modifying that net purchase price. So if there's an addendum that's talking about the seller concessions, for example, you'd want to include that. We want to have documentation of those waivers that are going to be included. Okay, so you know, if that's is any additional evidence for those waivers, that should be included as well. And that, so for example, the form 2.14, the waiver addendum redacted, that should be included to provide evidence of those waivers, if there in fact was waivers from the competing offer. And then we say it's got, obviously it's got to be a good faith offer. Okay, it can't be something ginned up. That would be fraud, violation of law, violation of ethics, of course, all of that. It's got to be a real bona fide offer from a competing buyer, and it can't be certain things. Okay, so it can't be an offer that isn't paying all the purchase price in one sum at closing. Okay, so if there's installment payments, and really 1 and 2 are going to kind of usually be the same thing, because that typically would be like a seller finance transaction. You can't do it with seller financing. Okay, it's apples and oranges if one offer is seller finance, the other offer is not seller finance. Okay, now if the parties want to create an escalation scenario out of 2 seller financed offers, they could do that, but they'd need to write that in to an addendum. It's not part of this. We want to, in this situation, we want to prevent the apples and oranges in the 99% of the time where the offer is not going to be a seller financed offer. And so we don't want the seller coming back showing evidence of a seller financed offer to try to trigger the escalation. Okay, so it's got to all be a lump sum payment at the end, whether that's cash or financed. Can't be seller financing, can't have an extra long closing date, okay, because that's sort of not really going to be kind of competitive terms. So we say if it's more than, we had to pick an amount, if it's more than 90 calendar days for a closing date out, then that's not going to be able to be used to trigger this. You know, if it's a 6 months out, that's not really a competitive offer. That shouldn't be allowed to be used to trigger this. If it's late or expired, okay, so if the when they're going to show that to the buyer, if it's like not even a valid offer anymore, there's no risk to the buyer filling out this form that the seller actually could even accept that other offer. That's not going to count. Okay, the seller already made a choice to ignore that other offer, to not accept it. It's no longer going to be valid as triggering the escalation clause. No contingencies on the like the contingent right to purchase. Okay, if the other buyer is saying, "Hey, seller, I'm offering you 500,000, but only if my other house sells," okay, that can't be used. That's just not competitive enough of an offer to really try to bind this buyer to agree to those terms. Also, buyer pre-occupancy. If that other buyer is saying, "Hey, I want to move in for a period of time before closing," that's also really kind of an unattractive, non-competitive thing. We don't want that to be used in the offer that triggers this escalation, because it may be the case that seller never really would entertain accepting that offer to begin with. So those are some terms. Again, not perfect, but we had to create a list just to try to avoid the apples and oranges situation. Certainly welcome your feedback if you think other things should be on that list for future rounds of this form. Now, once buyer's been presented with that competing offer and evidence of that offer and waivers, the buyer will have an opportunity to sign off on the deal down in section 13, which is where they're actually agreeing to escalate. Okay, and if they sign that and agree to escalate, then they will send this back to the seller, and that will be a binding agreement for the escalated terms. Now, upon Yeah, so that is that. So that's that opportunity for buyer to confirm and say, yes, we are affirmatively moving forward under these terms based upon the evidence that you provided to me. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. So that's going to be in section 13, but section 11 comes first. This is the waiver issue. So we say that seller will be deemed to have waived their right to invoke the escalation and will be bound by the terms of the buyer's original offer if the seller signs the original offer before they have gone through this escalation process. Okay, so it's really important the seller does not just agree to the buyer's underlying offer, because the buyer's underlying offer exists, and then this escalation clause is modifying that offer. If the seller just were to sign that original offer before they had gone through the process of getting agreement on the escalation addendum, the seller would just be agreeing to the original terms. Okay, so seller just needs to be careful with that. That's different about ours than a traditional escalation clause. They're going to want to hold off on signing that. Now, I think the best practice would be, and I think we're going to clarify this in an update, the best practice would be if the parties agree to the escalation addendum, okay, and the buyer signs off in section 13 at the bottom of the document, which we'll show you in a second, then the seller, that's an agreement to escalate the offer. And then the seller should also sign the underlying sale agreement, and those two together would operate together. And then the escalation request, okay, is section 12. So this is where the seller signs off and says, hey, seller, or hey, buyer, I've attached everything you've asked for. You've seen the evidence. I'm returning this to you. I want to enter into the agreement under the terms of the escalation. Please sign section 13 below, agreeing to the escalation. And that's what the buyer has the opportunity to do. And that's the bottom of the document, the last section of the document. Okay, so now we are looking at some forthcoming changes to this because we think one of the main advantages of the way we set this up is that the buyer has had that opportunity to review the other offer first, so they know what they're agreeing to, and we remove that whole ambiguity that we talked about earlier. We think there's an additional step, though, that could be used to remove that ambiguity, which is just to actually have written in what those final terms are, both in terms of the net purchase price and any waivers that are going to be part of the deal. So we're looking to add a section or add a portion in section 12 where the seller would have an opportunity to actually describe, based on the competing offer, what they believe the escalated price and terms to be. Okay, so there'd be a field to enter the price, okay, and there would be a field to check any waivers that are going to apply. Now, when seller sends this back to buyer, buyer is going to look at this section and confirm that that is in fact what the competing offer plus the buyer's escalation offer dictate, okay, that they're in the same terms about, yes, this is the net purchase price and these are the waivers that result from my invitation to escalate based upon the competing offer. And then when the buyer signs in section 13, there really can be no ambiguity or disagreement about the ultimate terms. So that's a piece that we're going to add in for an update to just even create more clarity on agreement on the ultimate price and terms. I see something in the chat here. Let's see, what did I miss? Seller gets an offer. Seller gives escalation invite to buyer. Doesn't buyer give initial escalation to seller? Where is it? Yeah, no, so this form is, so the question was about who does what, you know, who sends what to whom. This form is filled out initially by buyer as an invitation to the seller to come back to buyer to escalate the buyer's offer based on the competing offer. So this form is always initiated by the buyer, but there is an interim step where the seller comes back to the buyer with the evidence, okay, and then the buyer has the opportunity to finally sign off on it so that there is ultimate agreement, okay? So it operates, essentially the buyer is saying, inviting the seller to counter offer them based upon the terms of the escalation and the competing offer. The seller is then doing that, Okay, and then the buyer is ultimately agreeing to the final price and terms. So there's some back and forth, but it's always initiated by the buyer. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And then we would modify that section 13 as well, based upon the modification that we're making in section 12 to mention as the terms described up in section 12 above, and that we instruct buyer, hey, if you don't believe that seller captured in section 12 the actual price and terms that would result from the escalation and the competing offer, then you shouldn't agree to this. Okay, you still have some more negotiating that you need to do. All right, so that is our invitation to escalate form. Are there any more questions that people want to talk about related to this form? Looks like we're at 10:57. We have a couple minutes. And there we do have that 11 o'clock open house. If folks want to jump over to that to talk with Nicholas about any other forms as well. All right, I'll just hang for a couple minutes to see if anyone comes in with any questions. And while we're doing that, let me grab the link to the open house so that those of you who do want to head over to that to ask about or learn about different forms, that you can go pop into that meeting. Let's see. All right. All right, here's that link. Let me drop it in the chat. All right, so just drop a link in the chat if you want to go to the open house. It starts at 11. All right. Appears time limits on offers presented would not or may not allow. Sorry, I'm trying to read this chat question here. Negotiating through the escalation process. Yeah, I mean, the fact that we're asking the seller to get back to the buyer before the buyer's deadline does, put some time pressure on this. But the parties are always, this is a negotiation, so the parties can always still agree to something. And really at the end of the day, if a buyer wants to agree to the ultimate price, they can do that. And this is essentially a counteroffer from the seller. So the buyer can agree to it and be bound by it. What we're just trying to do is make sure that seller doesn't delay, because buyer could move on. So, at the end of the day, parties can agree to anything. If I send you an offer and give you a certain deadline, if you come back to me late and I still want to accept your counteroffer, I can do that. And that's perfectly fine. So the parties could still figure it out. What we wanted to avoid is that risk of the buyer just going to move on. I mean, if the seller doesn't come back and start this negotiation process over the escalation before the buyer's offer deadline, buyer's going to say, hey, seller didn't want to negotiate with me. They missed my deadline. I'm moving on to another house. So that's really the main point of that provision. All right, everybody, we're at 11. So thanks for joining. We'll see you next week, and feel free to hop over to the open house. Take care and have a good weekend.